The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl to a rotted shelf, and the object she found destroyed his assumptions. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On a cold and foggy afternoon, the sound of roaring motorcycles echoed through the desolate streets of a small town. A weathered Hells Angels biker, known as Jake, cruised down the narrow road, his mind lost in the memories of a life lived on the edge. He had seen it all: violence, betrayal, and countless dangerous roads. But that day, his focus was broken by something unusual. A small figure caught his attention. A young girl, no older than 10, standing alone by an old, crumbling building. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, and she seemed unaware of the biker who had noticed her. Jake slowed his bike, the tires crunching over the gravel. He watched her for a moment, debating whether to continue or stop. He had no interest in small talk or interruptions, but there was something about the girl that pulled at him. She looked like she didn't belong in this part of town. It was a place for bikers, outlaws, and people who kept to themselves, but not children. She seemed out of place, almost as if she were lost. Something didn't sit right with him. He decided to follow his gut. He parked his bike at a safe distance and quietly approached. The girl, unaware of his presence, continued to look at the decaying structure ahead of her. As he got closer, Jake could see that the building was nothing more than a forgotten relic. The paint was peeling, windows were boarded up, and the door sagged on its hinges. It seemed like it had been abandoned for years. The biker hesitated, but then noticed the girl move toward the back of the building. He followed her, curiosity growing. What was she doing here? Why was she alone? He needed to know. As he reached the back of the building, he saw her pull open a rotted shelf near the wall. The wood creaked under her touch, revealing an old box hidden behind a pile of broken furniture and debris. The girl's small fingers worked quickly, and soon, she held up an object in her hand. It was a dusty, weathered book, its cover cracked and stained with age. She stared at it for a long moment, as if contemplating its significance. Jake, standing in the shadows, couldn't help but wonder what she had found. This wasn't just any old book. There was something about it that felt important, as though it held secrets long forgotten. The girl's eyes flickered up at that moment, locking onto Jake's, and for the first time, she seemed to notice his presence. She didn't flinch, nor did she scream. Instead, she simply asked, "Are you here to take it?" Jake stood frozen, caught off guard by her question. What was she talking about? He hadn't expected to encounter anything like this today. The book was clearly important to her, but why? And why was it hidden here, in this forsaken place? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Just as Jake was about to speak, the girl looked down at the book once more, then slowly handed it to him. "I think it's time you knew," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, leaving Jake more confused than ever. What was she trying to tell him? And why did it feel like everything he thought he knew was about to change? The girl's eyes locked onto Jake's, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. She was waiting for him to make a move, her small hand still extended, the book resting in her palm. He reached out cautiously, taking the book from her, the weight of it surprising him. It wasn't heavy, but it felt important, like it had carried secrets for a long time. Jake's mind raced. What had she meant by her words? "I think it's time you knew." What was inside this book that could change everything he thought he knew about his life? He stared at the weathered cover, but it didn't reveal anything obvious. No title, no author, just a strange symbol that almost seemed familiar, but he couldn't place where he had seen it before. He tried to read the girl's face, but it was unreadable. There was something calm about her expression, a kind of certainty that he wasn't used to seeing in a child. She wasn't scared. She wasn't nervous. She was just waiting for him to open it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't fully understand. Something that had been hidden for far too long. "Why do you have this book?" Jake asked, his voice gruff, as he carefully flipped it open. The pages were old, the edges frayed, but the writing was still legible. Strange symbols filled the pages, some of them looking like a foreign language he had never seen before. But others looked like they were written in a code. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages, the weight of the discovery beginning to settle on his shoulders. The girl stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a book. It's a map," she said, her eyes flickering towards the shelf where she had found it. Jake looked back at her, puzzled. A map to what? She didn't answer immediately, instead glancing around as if she was checking to make sure no one else was listening. "A map to my father's legacy," she finally said. "And to yours." Jake's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean, his legacy? And how did it tie into his? He had never heard of anything like this before. His life, his past, had always been one of chaos and violence, but it had never been about hidden legacies or secret maps. What could this child possibly know about his father? His mind flashed back to his own childhood, a time he'd tried to bury. He remembered his father's cryptic words, his mother's distant silence, and the strange things he'd overheard when he was a child. Could it be? Was there more to his past than he'd ever been told? The girl took a deep breath, her small hands clasped together in front of her. "My father was part of something much bigger than you think. He didn't just disappear. He went into hiding, and he left clues for people who were meant to find them." Jake stared at her, trying to piece everything together. This little girl, standing in front of him with an old book in her hands, knew more about his past than he did. It was unnerving. "What kind of clues?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. She smiled faintly, almost knowingly. "I can't tell you everything yet," she said softly, her gaze shifting to the book in his hands. "But there's one thing I can tell you. That book is the key. If you follow the map, you'll find out who you really are." Jake's head spun. He had lived his life on the road, lived by the code of the Hells Angels, never questioning where he came from or who he really was. But now, this child was telling him there was something more to his story, something he needed to uncover, something that could change everything. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves on the ground around them. Jake looked down at the book, then back at the girl. She was still watching him intently, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and determination. He didn't know what was happening or where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away now. Whatever secrets this book held, whatever legacy his father had left behind, he was going to find out. He had to. Jake took a deep breath and looked at the girl again. "Where do we start?" The girl's smile widened, her eyes lighting up with relief. "We start with the first clue," she said, stepping aside. "Follow me." And with that, they began to walk toward the next part of the mystery, the road ahead uncertain, but filled with the promise of answers to the questions that had haunted Jake for years. As Jake followed the little girl down the narrow, winding path, the air grew heavier, thick with the sense of an impending storm. The map from the old book had led them to this part of town, an area that seemed as forgotten as the book itself. Buildings here were older, more worn down, and the streets were nearly empty. It was a quiet place, almost eerie, and Jake could feel the weight of history pressing in on him. The girl, walking ahead, seemed unaffected by the atmosphere. She moved with purpose, as if she knew exactly where they were going. Her small feet barely made a sound as they echoed off the cracked pavement. Jake kept his distance, his eyes scanning the surroundings, still processing what had just happened. The book was much more than he had ever expected. And now, following this child, it was becoming clear that his life was about to take a turn he hadn't prepared for. The girl suddenly stopped in front of a tall, decaying building, its windows boarded up and the front door hanging on its last hinges. She looked up at it, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said softly. "This is where the next clue is hidden." Jake stepped forward, eyeing the building. There was something about it that felt off. It was a place he wouldn't normally venture into, but the mystery surrounding the book, the girl, and the legacy of his father pulled at him. He couldn't turn back now. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice gruff. The girl nodded, her hand resting on the door. "It's in there," she replied, "the next part of the map. The answer to everything." With a deep breath, Jake pushed the door open. The creaking sound echoed in the silent streets, as if the building itself was protesting their intrusion. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Shadows danced on the walls, distorted by the weak light filtering through the cracks. The girl led the way, her steps sure and quick. Jake followed her, the floor beneath them groaning with each step. They passed old furniture, broken remnants of a life once lived in this space. There were piles of old books, rusted tools, and torn curtains that fluttered like ghosts in the breeze. As they moved deeper into the building, the girl stopped in front of a wall. Jake raised an eyebrow. It looked like a simple, unremarkable wall. But the girl smiled, her eyes twinkling with something between mischief and knowledge. "Right here," she said, and Jake watched as she pressed a loose brick in the corner. With a click, the brick slid back, revealing a hidden compartment. His heart raced as she reached inside and pulled out a small, weathered box. The box was old, its edges worn smooth by time, and it seemed to hum with an energy that sent a chill down his spine. The girl handed it to Jake, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the key to your past." Jake hesitated for a moment, then carefully opened the box. Inside, there was a collection of old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. His fingers trembled as he pulled one out. It was a picture of a man he didn't recognize at first, but the face was eerily familiar. It was a younger version of his father, standing beside a woman he didn't know. In the background, there was a small, crumbling building that looked just like the one they were in now. The woman in the photograph was smiling, her eyes full of life. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time he had ever seen a picture of his father from this time. And this woman, who was she? "That's my mother," the girl said, her voice quiet. "The woman in the picture is the key to everything. Your father's secrets, his past. Everything you've been looking for." Jake's mind raced. His mother? Was this really true? He had always believed his parents' pasts were clouded in mystery. But this was something different. He looked at the girl, her expression unwavering, and finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "How do you know all of this?" The girl smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I'm not just some random child," she said. "I'm the daughter of your father's closest friend, the one who disappeared." Jake's stomach churned. His father had a friend who disappeared? Who was he? And why hadn't Jake known anything about him? Before he could ask more, the girl spoke again. "There's more, but it's dangerous. We have to move fast." Jake nodded, his mind racing. The answers he had been searching for were finally within his reach. But at what cost? The storm was coming, and so was the danger that followed the legacy of the past. The truth was now closer than ever, but the question remained. Would Jake be able to face it? Jake's mind was racing as he held the old photograph in his hand. The woman in the picture looked so familiar, but he couldn't place her. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the discovery settled over him. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "She's the key to everything." His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. His father had a friend who had disappeared, and now this mystery woman was somehow tied to his past. He had spent his life searching for answers, and now, it felt like the truth was slipping just out of his reach. The girl was still standing beside him, waiting for him to speak, but he couldn't form the words. He turned the photograph over, hoping for some clue on the back, but there was nothing. Just the faded image of his father and the woman standing beside him. The building in the background was the same one they had just come from, the one that seemed to hold so many secrets. Who was she? Jake finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. The girl looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Her name was Sarah," she said softly. "She was your father's closest friend, the one who disappeared." Jake's mind reeled. Sarah? The woman in the picture had the same name as his mother. Was this a coincidence? Or was there something more to it? He looked at the girl, searching her face for answers. "Why didn't I know about her?" he asked. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" The girl sighed, her small shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had fallen on her. "Because your father wanted to protect you. There are things in his past that he didn't want you to know. Things that were too dangerous for you to understand." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Dangerous? What had his father been involved in? What was so dangerous that it had to be kept hidden from him for all these years? "What kind of things?" Jake asked, his voice tight. The girl hesitated for a moment before answering. "Your father was part of something much bigger than the Hells Angels. Something that started long before he joined the club." Jake's heart skipped a beat. What was she talking about? The Hells Angels had been his life, his family. Everything he had known had been shaped by the club. But now, it seemed there was a whole other side to his father's story that he hadn't known about. What was he a part of? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. The girl stepped closer, her eyes intense as she spoke. He was part of a secret group, one that worked in the shadows, far from the public eye. They had a different code, one that wasn't about loyalty or brotherhood. It was about power and control, and they would do anything to protect their secrets. Jake's stomach twisted. This was not the man he had known, the father he had looked up to his whole life. The man who had raised him, who had taught him everything he knew. How could he have been a part of something so dark? Why are you telling me this? Jake asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. The girl looked at him, her face serious. Because it's time for you to know the truth. You're the only one left who can stop what's coming. Your father's past is coming for you, and you can't hide from it anymore. Jake's mind was spinning. What was she talking about? He didn't understand. What do you mean, stop what's coming? He asked, his voice hoarse. The girl glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. The people your father was involved with, they're still out there. And they're looking for you. They think you know something that could destroy them, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had spent his life running from his past, from the violence and the chaos. But now, it seemed like his past was catching up with him. What am I supposed to do? Jake asked, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The girl's eyes softened. You have to finish what your father started. You have to find the truth before they do. Jake looked down at the photograph in his hand, his fingers trembling. The truth? What truth? And how was he supposed to find it? The girl turned and began walking toward the door of the building. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the photograph. The woman in the picture had known his father. She had been a part of his life, a part of his past. And now, somehow, she was a part of his future. Let's go, the girl said, her voice calm but urgent. We don't have much time. Jake followed her, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Whatever was coming, whatever danger lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to face it alone. The answers were out there, and he was going to find them. He had to. For his father. For himself. The girl led Jake through the dark corridors of the abandoned building, her steps light and quick. Jake's mind was still reeling from the revelations. His father, part of a secret group, involved in something dangerous and hidden from him all his life. He could hardly process it. But one thing was clear. His past, the truth about his family, was no longer just a mystery to solve. It was a threat, and it was coming for him. The girl stopped in front of a rusted metal door at the end of the hallway. She turned to face Jake, her expression solemn. This is it. This is where the answers are. Jake's heart pounded. It felt like he had stepped into a different world, one filled with danger and dark secrets that had been buried for years. He had always known there was something more to his father's past. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. What's behind that door? He asked, his voice rough with uncertainty. The girl didn't answer immediately. She simply reached for the door handle and pulled it open, revealing a small room filled with old files, documents, and strange symbols on the walls. It looked like a secret office, one that had been left untouched for decades. This is where your father's work was stored, she said quietly. The legacy he left behind. Jake stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the walls and the cluttered desk. There were stacks of papers, some yellowed with age, others still in pristine condition. He walked over to the desk and pulled out a folder, the label on it faded and barely legible. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing maps, photographs, and notes in his father's handwriting. It was like stepping into a time machine, reading through the history of a man he thought he knew, but now realized he barely understood. The girl stood by the door, watching him silently. Do you recognize any of this? She asked. Jake shook his head, feeling a sense of dread creeping up his spine. No, he said, his voice hoarse. But it's all connected. All of it. My father wasn't just a part of the Hells Angels. He was involved in something bigger, something I didn't even know existed. He flipped through the papers, each one a piece of the puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. There were mentions of powerful figures, hidden locations, and coded messages. It was like his father had been preparing for something that would affect not just their lives, but the entire world. As Jake continued to read, the pieces started to fall into place. His father had been trying to protect him, to keep him away from this world. But now, with everything exposed, Jake couldn't help but feel like he was being drawn into it, whether he liked it or not. What do we do now? He asked, looking up from the papers. The girl's eyes were intense, almost knowing. We find the next clue. We finish what your father started. Jake's mind raced. He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever this next step was, but he knew he didn't have a choice. He had to follow this path, for the truth and for his father. The girl turned and walked toward a shelf at the back of the room, pulling out a small box. She handed it to Jake, her expression grave. "This is the key," she said. "It's the last piece of the puzzle." Jake opened the box carefully, his hands shaking. Inside, there was a key, old and worn, with a strange symbol carved into it. It looked like something out of a storybook, but Jake knew it was real. It was real, and it was the answer to everything. The girl stood beside him, her gaze unwavering. "This key will lead you to the next part of the map. Your father hid it away, knowing that one day, someone would come looking for it." Jake stared at the key, his mind racing with questions. "Where do I go now?" he asked. The girl smiled faintly, as if she knew exactly what was going through his mind. "You'll know," she said. "You've always known." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The girl was right. He had always felt like there was something more to his life, something beyond the club, beyond the violence and the chaos. But now, he was standing at the edge of something much bigger. The past was coming to claim him, and the only way out was to face it head-on. He gripped the key tightly, determination flooding his veins. "I'll find it," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll finish what he started." With that, the girl turned and walked toward the door. Jake followed her, the weight of the key in his pocket heavy with promise. The answers were out there, waiting for him to find them. And no matter what it took, he would uncover the truth about his father, about his legacy, and about the dangerous world they had both been a part of. The storm outside had finally arrived, but Jake wasn't afraid. He had found his purpose, and there was no turning back now. Jake stood in the dimly lit room, his hand clenched around the key. The girl beside him, still quiet, was looking at him with that same intensity as before, like she knew more than she was saying. The storm outside was fierce now, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing, the next step. Where did this key lead? What was his father involved in? And why was he only now being pulled into this dangerous world? He couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the photograph, the one who had been so close to his father. His thoughts were interrupted when the girl spoke, her voice calm, yet urgent. "The key is only part of the answer. You need to go to the old lighthouse. It's where everything started, and where it will all end." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. A lighthouse. In all his years, he had never heard his father mention a lighthouse. His life had been about the Hells Angels, the Brotherhood, and the endless road. But now, there was a new piece to the puzzle, something he had never been told. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The girl turned and walked toward the door, and Jake followed her without a word. The journey to the lighthouse felt longer than it should have. Every mile that passed seemed to weigh heavier on Jake's shoulders. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about his father's life before the Hells Angels. This lighthouse could hold the key to answers he had been searching for his entire life. They finally reached the outskirts of town, where the road ended and the rugged coastline began. The lighthouse stood tall in the distance, its light cutting through the stormy night like a beacon. As they approached, Jake's heart raced. The place looked ancient, worn by time and the elements, but it felt strangely familiar, as if it had always been part of his story. The girl stopped a few feet from the entrance and turned to him. "It's here. This is where it all began." Jake stared at the lighthouse, his mind spinning. What had his father been involved in all those years ago? Why had he kept this part of his life hidden from him? And what did this key open? The girl stepped forward and unlocked the door, her movements practiced, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The door creaked open, and Jake followed her inside. The interior of the lighthouse was dark, save for the flickering light of a single lamp. The walls were lined with old maps, yellowed documents, and photographs that seemed to tell a story Jake had never heard. In the center of the room, there was a large desk, covered in papers and books. The girl moved toward it and began rifling through the piles. Jake stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a place frozen in the past. As the girl dug through the documents, Jake's attention was drawn to an old photograph pinned to the wall. It was a picture of his father, standing with several men, all wearing the same symbol. A symbol Jake recognized from the Hells Angels, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a patch on a leather jacket. It was a symbol of something more. He walked over to the photograph and studied it closely. The men in the picture were all older, more weathered than the ones he had seen in the club, but they had the same look, hard, determined, and loyal to something beyond just the brotherhood. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl turned and looked at the photograph. "That's your father's first family," she said. "Before the Hells Angels, before the life he built. These men were part of something much older, something your father left behind. And now it's time for you to understand why." Jake's stomach tightened. First family? What did she mean? The girl walked over to the desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a small, weathered journal. She handed it to Jake, her expression serious. "Your father wrote this. It's the last thing he left for you. If you want to know the truth, you have to read it." Jake took the journal in his hands, his fingers brushing the cover. It was old, the leather worn and cracked, but it felt heavy with significance. He opened it, and the first page was filled with his father's familiar handwriting. The words were shaky, as if written in haste, but they were clear. Asterisk, "I've done things I can't undo. I've been part of something much darker than anyone can imagine. I never wanted you to know this, but it's time. The past is coming for us, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. You have to be ready. The lighthouse is the key to everything." Asterisk, the words hit Jake like a freight train. The lighthouse. His father had known. He had known this day would come. The truth was out there, hidden away for all these years, and now it was finally in his hands. But the question was, what would he do with it? The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if the world itself was closing in on him. Jake looked up at the girl, his mind racing. "What do I do now?" The girl smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Now, you finish what your father started. You find the rest of the answers, and you make things right." Jake nodded, the weight of his father's legacy heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but one thing was clear. He was ready. Ready to uncover the truth. Ready to face whatever came next. Because this time, he wouldn't run. He was going to finish what his father started. Jake felt a strange calm settle over him as he stared at the journal his father had left behind. The words written inside were the beginning of something that had always been just out of reach, but now, it was real, and it was his responsibility to see it through. The girl stood silently beside him, her expression unwavering as she watched him process the truth about his father's life. He had spent so many years in the Hells Angels, thinking that was all there was to his story, but now, everything was changing. The key, the lighthouse, and the journal, it was all part of a much bigger puzzle. His father's past was finally coming to light, and Jake was the only one left to finish what had been started. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had no choice. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the cracks in the lighthouse as if nature itself was trying to warn him. He took a deep breath and closed the journal, tucking it under his arm. "What now?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The girl turned to him, her eyes shining with an intensity that matched the storm outside. "Now we find the next piece of the puzzle," she said. "Your father left you everything you need. You just have to be willing to look for it." Jake nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. He had followed the clues this far, but there was still so much to uncover. The key he had found earlier was just the beginning. "Where do we go next?" he asked. The girl stepped forward and placed a hand on the wall, pushing aside an old map pinned to the surface. Beneath it was a hidden compartment, just big enough for a small box. She opened it slowly, revealing an old compass and a set of coordinates written in his father's handwriting. "This," she said, handing the compass to Jake, "is the next step. It will guide you to the next location." Jake took the compass, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It wasn't just a simple tool. It was another clue, another piece of the puzzle his father had left behind. The coordinates were written on the back, and Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw the location. It was a place he knew all too well, the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The warehouse had always been a mysterious place, even before his time with the Hells Angels. It had been the site of countless deals, shady meetings, and whispered rumors. But Jake had never been inside. Now, it seemed, he had no choice but to go there. He looked at the girl, who seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's time, Jake," she said softly. "Your father's past is waiting for you there. You have to go." Jake nodded, the weight of his father's legacy settling heavily on his shoulders. The storm outside had begun to quiet, and as he stepped toward the door, he felt a strange sense of resolve. The answers were out there, and he wasn't going to back down. He walked out into the night, the compass in his hand guiding him forward. The warehouse was only a few miles away, but every step he took felt like a journey into the unknown. As he approached the old building, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was something about this place that felt different tonight. It wasn't just an abandoned warehouse anymore. It was a part of his father's hidden world, and now it was a part of his. Jake stepped inside, the sound of his boots echoing through the empty space. The warehouse was dark, save for a single light in the corner. As he walked deeper into the shadows, he could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, his senses on high alert. The air in the warehouse was thick with dust and neglect, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the darkness. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just some random person. This was someone from his father's world, someone who knew more than he was willing to share. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low and controlled. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the debris on the floor. "You're looking for the truth," the man said, his voice gravelly and low. "But be careful, Jake. The truth isn't always what you expect." Jake's mind raced. How did this man know his name? How did he know what he was searching for? "What do you want?" Jake demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife tucked into his belt. The man chuckled darkly, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. "I don't want anything from you. But your father, he wanted me to find you." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His father had been involved with this man, and now, this man was here, waiting for Jake to uncover the rest of the mystery. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever this man had to offer, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't turn back now. "What do I need to know?" Jake asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The man stepped closer, his face coming into the light. He was older than Jake had expected, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. "Follow me," the man said, his voice cold and final. "The truth is waiting." Jake hesitated for only a moment before he followed the man deeper into the warehouse. The answers were getting closer, but so was the danger. And Jake was ready to face whatever came next. Jake followed the man deeper into the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the space. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Every inch of the room seemed to be filled with the weight of secrets, each shadow hiding something more than it let on. The man ahead of him didn't speak, but Jake felt the presence of something important hanging between them. It was as if he had crossed a line, stepping into a world that was no longer his own. The warehouse stretched out before him like a maze, the long corridors winding between shelves filled with old equipment and forgotten machinery. The light flickered overhead, casting odd, shifting shadows on the walls. It felt like time had stopped here, like the world outside had long forgotten this place. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice low but filled with the urgency of someone who needed answers. The man didn't stop walking, but he turned his head slightly, as though considering Jake's question. "This is where it all started," he said, his tone flat. "Where your father's work began. Where everything changed." Jake's stomach tightened. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but the way he said it made his skin prickle. His father's work? The idea of his father having any work outside of the Hells Angels, outside of the life Jake had known, felt foreign to him. It didn't make sense. They reached the end of the hallway, and the man stopped. In front of a metal door. He fumbled for a moment with a key, sliding it into the lock, and with a quiet click, the door creaked open. Inside was a room, dimly lit and filled with old files, maps, and documents stacked in neat piles. On the far side of the room, there was a large table, covered in what looked like blueprints and photographs. As Jake stepped inside, his eyes scanned the room. It was as if everything was frozen in time. The man walked to the table, his hands sweeping over the papers, and picked up a photograph. He handed it to Jake. It was a picture of his father, standing alongside a group of men, all dressed in suits, looking serious. The background was a place Jake didn't recognize, a building that looked old, almost like something out of a history book. His father's face was young in the photo, but Jake could see the same intensity in his eyes, the same determination that had always been there. "This is where your father came from," the man said, his voice soft but insistent. This was his first family. The Hell's Angels weren't the beginning. They were just a part of something much bigger. This, he gestured to the room around them, was his real legacy. Jake's mind raced. He had always thought his father's story began with the Hell's Angels, with the brotherhood that had shaped their lives. But now, it seemed like there was a whole other layer to it, one that had been hidden from him for years. "Who are these people?" Jake asked, his voice tight with confusion and anger. "What was my father really involved in?" The man's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer to Jake, his gaze intense. "Your father was part of a secret organization, not just a club. He was involved in something that went far beyond the Hell's Angels. This organization," he paused, as though choosing his words carefully, "controlled things from the shadows. Politics, business, power. They were always a step ahead of everyone else. Your father was their enforcer, their protector." Jake felt a surge of disbelief. His father, the man who had raised him, who had taught him everything he knew, had been part of something so vast, so secret, and so dangerous? It didn't make sense. "Why didn't he tell me?" Jake muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. The man looked at him, his expression hardening. "Because he wanted to protect you. He didn't want you to get pulled into this world. But the world is changing, Jake. Your father's enemies are still out there, and they think you know something you don't. They think you're the key to everything." Jake's blood ran cold. Enemies? What was this man talking about? "What do they want from me?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped back, his eyes scanning the room as if making sure no one else was listening. "They want the truth. They want what your father left behind. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." Jake's heart hammered in his chest. The truth? What truth? Was there something his father had hidden from him? Something that could change everything? "What do I do now?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. The man stared at him for a moment, his face unreadable. "You follow the clues your father left. You finish what he started. If you want to survive, if you want to protect everything your father worked for, you have to find the rest of the answers." Jake stood there for a moment, the weight of the man's words sinking in. His life had just become more complicated than he could have ever imagined. But one thing was clear. His father's legacy, his own fate, was now in his hands. And he wasn't about to let it slip away. "Where do I start?" Jake asked, his voice steady. The man's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You already know," he said. "The map is already in your hands. You just have to follow it." Jake nodded. The pieces were falling into place. It was time to face the truth, no matter where it led. With the photograph of his father in one hand and the weight of his legacy in the other, Jake stepped forward. This was his fight now. He wasn't running anymore. He was going to find the answers, no matter the cost. Jake's grip tightened around the photograph of his father as he stood in the dimly lit warehouse, the weight of the man's words still pressing on him. He had never imagined this side of his father's life, a hidden world of power and secrecy, and now it was up to him to finish what had been started. The man had handed him the key, the compass, and now, the path was clear, though he had no idea where it would lead. As the man began to walk away, Jake followed, his footsteps heavy with the realization that this was no longer just about uncovering his father's past. It was about survival. The storm outside had calmed, but Jake's mind was still racing. He had 1,000 questions, but he knew there was no time to waste. He needed to follow the clues. He needed to find the answers. The man led him out of the warehouse and into a narrow alleyway, the cold night air biting at Jake's skin. They walked in silence, the only sound being the soft rustle of their footsteps on the wet pavement. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but he didn't say anything. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him to stay alert. They reached a small, inconspicuous car parked at the end of the alley. The man unlocked it with a flick of his wrist, and they both climbed inside. Jake settled into the passenger seat, the cool leather pressing against his legs, but his mind was still elsewhere. The car started with a soft hum, and they drove through the quiet streets, the headlights casting long shadows in the distance. Jake couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting someone to be following them. The man seemed calm, unbothered by the tension in the air, but Jake knew better than to assume everything was fine. Where are we going? Jake asked, his voice low. The man glanced at him briefly before focusing on the road ahead. We're going to see someone who can help you. Someone who knows more about your father's legacy than anyone else. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Who could know more about his father's past than the man who had raised him? But he didn't question it. Not yet. The car turned onto a narrow road that wound its way through the outskirts of the city. The buildings became sparse, the lights fewer and farther between. They were heading into a part of town Jake had never been to, a place where the streets were dark, and the air felt thicker, heavier. Finally, the car came to a stop in front of an old, run-down building, its windows boarded up, and its door barely hanging on its hinges. The man turned to Jake, his expression unreadable. This is it, he said. Stay close. Trust no one. Jake nodded, his instincts kicking in as they both got out of the car. The man led the way, and Jake followed, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of danger. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell of dust and decay filled the air, but Jake's attention was focused on the figure sitting at the far end of the room. It was an older man, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes sharp and calculating. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who knew the weight of secrets and the price of betrayal. The man's eyes flickered to Jake, and for a moment, the room fell silent. So, this is the son, the old man said, his voice gravelly but steady. You look just like him. Jake stood there, unsure of what to say. The old man motioned for them to sit, and the man who had led Jake here took a seat across from him. Jake followed suit, his mind swirling with questions, but he remained silent, waiting for the man to speak. Your father was a part of something much bigger than the Hells Angels. A world that no one knows about, the old man continued. He didn't just protect people, he kept the balance. And now, that balance is shifting. You've been marked, Jake. Your father's enemies know who you are, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. Jake's heart raced. Enemies? What was he talking about? He had been raised to believe the Hells Angels were the most dangerous group in the world, but now it seemed like his father had been involved in something even more dangerous. What do they want? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. The old man looked at him, his eyes narrowing. They want control. Your father was the key to everything. And now that he's gone, they'll come for you. You have to be ready, Jake. You have to finish what your father started. He left you a legacy, and it's time for you to claim it. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. A legacy? What was he supposed to do with that? How do I stop them? Jake asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The old man leaned forward, his gaze sharp and calculating. You find the rest of the pieces, Jake. Your father left you a trail. The key, the compass, the map. It's all leading you to the truth. But you have to be careful. They'll be watching you every step of the way. Jake nodded, the weight of the old man's words settling over him. He had no choice but to follow this path, no matter where it led. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting everything his father had built, everything he had left behind. The old man leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Jake's. It's a dangerous game you're playing, Jake. But if you want to survive, you have to play it to the end. Jake didn't say anything. He wasn't sure he was ready for what was coming, but he knew one thing. He wasn't turning back. Not now. Not ever. Jake sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of the old man's words still pressing down on him. He had always known that his father was a man of mystery, but hearing about the larger, hidden world his father had been involved in, something far more dangerous than the Hells Angels, was overwhelming. The old man had made it clear. The legacy Jake's father had left behind was both a blessing and a curse. It was the key to understanding his father's life, but it also made Jake a target for those who would do anything to uncover what was hidden. The old man leaned back in his chair, watching Jake closely, as if waiting for him to make a decision. You'll have to move quickly, he said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. The people after you won't waste time. They know the pieces are falling into place. They'll be coming for you soon. Jake's heart raced. He wasn't sure what he was more afraid of, the fact that his father had left him with a dangerous legacy, or that he was now trapped in a game that he didn't fully understand. What exactly am I supposed to do? Jake asked, his voice tight with frustration. The old man gave him a hard look, his eyes narrowing. You follow the trail, he said. Your father didn't. Just leave you clues. He left you instructions. You have to finish what he started. The key, the map, the compass, they're all connected. You'll find the next piece at the old church by the river. That's where your father's journey ended. But be careful. The ones after you won't stop. Jake nodded, his mind whirling. An old church by the river? It wasn't much to go on, but it was all he had. And it was enough to make him realize one thing. He couldn't let fear control him anymore. He had to keep moving, keep searching. I'll go there, Jake said, his voice steady now. The old man stood up, his worn boots scraping against the floor. Good, he said, his voice softer now, almost kind. But remember, Jake, the truth isn't always what you expect. It's more than just the legacy your father left behind. There's a reason they want it. And it's not for power or money. It's for something far worse. The old man's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, but Jake didn't flinch. He had come too far to turn back now. He stood up, ready to face whatever came next. I'll find out the truth, Jake said, his eyes hardening with determination. And I'll make sure no one else gets hurt because of it. The old man nodded, his face unreadable. Just be careful, he warned. Once you uncover the truth, there's no going back. Jake didn't need to hear more. He was already heading for the door, his mind focused on the church by the river. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for whatever was waiting for him. As Jake stepped into the cold night air, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was about to do. The storm had passed, but the darkness still lingered, both outside and within him. He didn't know what he would find at the church, but he had to go. His father's secrets, his own past, and the dangerous people chasing him were all intertwined. And the only way to survive was to follow the trail, no matter where it led. The church by the river wasn't far, only a few miles outside the city. Jake drove with purpose, the road stretching out in front of him like a path to the unknown. The headlights of his motorcycle cut through the night, but the darkness felt suffocating. The river's sound grew louder as he approached the old church, a place he had never been. The building was crumbling, its steeple leaning at an angle, and the doors hung loosely on their hinges. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but Jake had learned not to trust appearances. He parked his bike in the overgrown lot and approached the church, the cold wind biting at his face. The door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping into the dark interior. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of decay filled his nostrils. It was quiet, too quiet. Jake's instincts were on high alert as he moved deeper into the church, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As he reached the altar, he noticed something that stopped him dead in his tracks. There, on the floor in front of the altar, was an old chest, its lid slightly ajar. The dim light from the shattered windows revealed the worn surface of the chest, its wood scarred by time. Jake approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come for answers, but was he ready to find them? He bent down and opened the chest, revealing a stack of old papers and a small, intricately carved box. The papers were filled with diagrams, codes, and references to places Jake didn't recognize. But it was the box that caught his attention. He lifted it carefully, his fingers brushing over the carvings. The symbol was familiar. He had seen it before. It was the same symbol from his father's photograph, the one that had been linked to the secret organization his father had been a part of. Jake opened the box, his heart racing. Inside was a small piece of metal, shaped like a key. It was different from the one he had been given earlier, but it was unmistakably a key. Another clue, another piece of the puzzle. As Jake held the key in his hand, he knew that the pieces were finally coming together. The truth was closer than ever, but so was the danger. The man who had warned him about the truth, the legacy, had been right. There was no turning back. The storm was far from over. But Jake was ready. He was going to finish this, no matter the cost. Jake stood in the cold, silent church, the weight of the small key pressing against his palm. He had come for answers, and now he had another piece of the puzzle. But it felt like the more he uncovered, the deeper the hole he was falling into. The room was still, except for the soft sound of the wind outside, rattling the shattered windows. The chest was empty now, the only thing left was the key, and it seemed like it held more questions than answers. Jake knew the next step wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth, but there was no going back now. He needed to know who had been pulling the strings, who his father had been protecting him from, and why the legacy was so important. The key felt like a tether, pulling him towards something far greater than he had ever expected. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from kneeling beside the chest. The dim light from the broken windows was enough to cast long shadows across the room, and for a moment, Jake felt as if the walls were closing in on him. He had been following a trail left by his father, but each step led him deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and lies. The storm outside had stopped, but Jake's mind was still a whirlwind of uncertainty. He turned to leave, but as he reached the door, something caught his eye. A piece of paper, yellowed with age, lay half-hidden beneath a pile of debris on the floor. Jake bent down and picked it up. It was a map, old and tattered, but still legible. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the familiar symbol, the same one that had been etched into the key. It was a map of the city, but the locations marked on it weren't just random places. They were the locations his father had visited in secret, places he had gone to hide, to protect the legacy. Jake's hands shook slightly as he traced the lines on the map. There were several locations marked, but one stood out, a location outside of town, near the old docks. His father had left him these clues for a reason. Jake knew this was the next step. He wasn't sure who he would find there, but he was certain it would lead him closer to the truth. The room seemed to close in on him as the weight of the decision settled in. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the past. He had to face it, no matter what. He stuffed the map into his jacket and walked back to the bike. The night air was cooler now, the fog rolling in from the bay, but Jake's mind was already on the next move. As he started the engine, he glanced back at the church. It felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The road to the docks was long, the moonlight barely illuminating the path, but Jake was used to traveling in the dark. He had done it his entire life. The bike roared beneath him as he sped down the empty road. The wind whipped against his face, but he didn't feel the chill. His mind was too focused on the task ahead. The docks were just outside the city limits, a place that had seen its share of shady deals and dark transactions. It was a place Jake had been to before, but never this deep into the area. The further he drove, the more isolated the place became. The road turned from paved to gravel, and the buildings grew older, falling apart from years of neglect. Finally, he reached the old warehouse near the docks. It was a hulking structure, its windows boarded up and the metal door hanging loosely on its hinges. Jake parked the bike and approached cautiously, his instincts on high alert. He wasn't sure what he would find here, but it felt like the end of the line. The door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. The smell of salt water and mildew hit him immediately. The space inside was vast, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the shore. Jake's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw the remnants of what had once been a thriving hub for shipments and deals. Now, it was abandoned, like everything else that had been part of his father's hidden world. He moved deeper into the warehouse, every step echoing in the emptiness. His mind was a whirl of questions, each one more pressing than the last. Who was behind this? Who had been hunting him and his father? And what was the legacy his father had been protecting for so long? At the far end of the warehouse, Jake spotted a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. Jake stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but low. As he took a step closer, the man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step forward, the light falling across his face. It was a face Jake didn't recognize, but there was something familiar about him. "I've been waiting for you," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. "Your father left me a message, and now, it's your turn to hear it." Jake's stomach dropped. A message? From his father? This was the moment he had been waiting for, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was ready for what he was about to hear. "What do you know about my father?" Jake asked, his voice tight with anticipation. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "I know everything," he said. "And now, it's time for you to know the rest." Jake stood still, staring at the man who claimed to know everything about his father. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and heavy. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process the enormity of what was happening. This wasn't just some random stranger in a forgotten warehouse. This man knew things that Jake didn't. Things about his father, about the life Jake had been thrust into, and most terrifyingly, about the legacy he now had to confront. "What do you mean? I'm supposed to know the rest?" Jake asked, his voice low but sharp. barely controlling the rising tension inside him. The man, still standing in the shadowed corner of the warehouse, took a step closer, his face finally illuminated by a shaft of dim light. There was a familiarity in his features, but Jake couldn't place it. Your father didn't just fight for the Hells Angels, Jake. He fought for something much bigger, the man said, his gravelly voice almost a whisper. Jake's mind raced, his breath catching in his throat. He had always believed his father's life had revolved around the brotherhood, the loyalty, and the chaos of the club. But this was different. There was something else. What are you talking about? Jake asked, his grip tightening on the key in his pocket. I'm talking about a war, Jake. A war that's been fought in the shadows for decades. And your father was one of the key players. But now that he's gone, it's your turn to take his place. Jake's stomach twisted. War? Shadows? His father was a soldier, sure, but he had never mentioned anything like this. His entire life had been shaped by the Hells Angels, and now this man was telling him that there was an even bigger battle? You're telling me my father was part of some secret war? Jake's voice cracked with disbelief. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he prepare me for this? The man sighed deeply, as if the weight of history pressed on him too. Your father did what he could to keep you away from it. He wanted to protect you from the world he had been part of. He thought you'd be better off not knowing the truth. Jake's mind was spinning. Protection. His father had wanted to protect him? So what now? Jake asked, still struggling to come to terms with what he was hearing. The man walked over to a nearby table, where a large map was spread out, covered with lines and markings. It was a map of the city, but there were more markings than Jake had ever seen. Locations, symbols, and numbers that didn't make sense to him. The man gestured for Jake to come closer. This is the map your father left behind. It's the key to understanding everything. Every marking on here represents a place he went, a decision he made, and a path that ultimately led him to the Hells Angels. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. His father's decisions had been more than just about bikes and brotherhood. There had been something far deeper, something Jake was now tied to. What do these markings mean? Jake asked, stepping closer to the table. The man traced a finger over the map, landing on one particular spot. This one, he said, is where it all began. Your father's first mission. The place where he became involved in the war. It's a facility outside the city, long abandoned, but still holding something important. Jake's pulse quickened. This was the clue he had been waiting for, the next step in the puzzle that seemed to stretch further than he had ever imagined. What's there? Jake asked, almost afraid of the answer. Your father's legacy, the man replied. There are things hidden in that facility that no one can afford to find. People have been looking for it for years. And now, they think you know where it is. Jake's chest tightened. People were after him. After his father's legacy. After whatever secrets were locked away in that facility. How do I find it? Jake asked, his voice low and determined. You follow the map, the man said. And you do what your father couldn't. You finish his mission. You stop them before they get what they want. The words hit Jake like a punch. He had been raised to ride, to fight, to survive. But this was different. This wasn't just about loyalty or family. This was about protecting something much bigger, something that had been hidden for far too long. And if I don't? Jake asked, almost daring the man to answer. The man didn't flinch. If you don't, he said quietly, then everything your father fought for will be destroyed. And so will you. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. It was about protecting the world his father had tried to shield him from, a world of power, secrets, and war. He had no choice. He had to follow this path. For his father. For himself. The man turned toward the door, motioning for Jake to follow. The clock is ticking, he said. Every minute you waste, they get closer. It's time to finish what your father started. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening like steel. The storm outside had nothing on the storm inside him now. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The next step was waiting for him. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to face the truth, to confront the legacy that had been passed down to him. He wasn't just Jake anymore. He was the son of a man who had lived and died by a code, and now it was his turn to take that mantle. With one last look at the map, Jake followed the man out into the night. The next chapter of his life was about to begin, and there was no turning back. Jake stood at the edge of the old facility, the darkened structure looming ahead, its decaying walls whispering of long-buried secrets. The map had led him here, to the final destination, the place where it all began, where his father's legacy had been forged in shadows. Every step he had taken, every clue he had uncovered, had led him to this moment. He was standing at the threshold of a mystery that was not just his father's, but his own now. He wasn't the same man who had ridden into this town months ago, searching for answers. No, he was different now, shaped by the truth, the revelations, and the danger that had followed him every step of the way. He had crossed the point of no return. There was no backing out now. The man who had led him here had disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake alone to face whatever lay within. The air was thick with tension as Jake approached the door. His heart beat in his chest like a drum, but his resolve remained solid. He had come too far to be afraid. He had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the people who had spent years hiding it. He pushed the door open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest as it crept inward. The room inside was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. The space was filled with old equipment, broken machinery, and papers scattered across the floor. But amidst the debris, one thing stood out, an old desk, covered in dust, with a single file resting on top. Jake approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. His instincts were screaming at him, telling him that the people who had been watching him were closer than ever. He reached for the file, his fingers brushing against the worn leather binding. As he pulled it open, a collection of old documents fell out, each one more cryptic than the last. But at the very top was a letter, his father's handwriting. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he read the words. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then the time has come for you to face the truth. Everything I did, every choice I made, was to protect you. The legacy I left behind is not just about power or wealth, it's about survival. The enemies we made will stop at nothing to destroy everything we built. They will come for you. You must be ready. Asterisk. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine as he read his father's final words. This was it. His father had known the day would come when Jake would have to face the consequences of their family's past. And now, it was his turn. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting everything his father had fought for. He gathered the documents, holding onto the letter tightly. There was no time to waste. He had to act now. He turned to leave, but the sound of footsteps made him freeze. A figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking his path. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood. Jake's instincts flared, and his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his side. You've come too far, the man said, his voice cold and menacing. Your father's legacy is not for you to claim. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the man. This was one of them, the people his father had warned him about, the ones who had been hunting him. What do you want? Jake asked, his voice steady but filled with anger. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light. What your father left behind. You don't understand what's at stake. The truth will destroy everything. Jake's grip tightened around the file. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. I know enough, Jake said, his voice hardening. And I'm not afraid of you. The man stepped forward, his posture threatening. You should be. Jake didn't wait. He lunged forward, using every bit of his strength to push the man back. The two collided, the force knocking them to the ground. The fight was brutal, fast, raw, and unforgiving. Jake fought with everything he had, using every trick his father had taught him over the years. The man was strong, but Jake was fueled by something deeper now. His father's words, the letter in his hand, the truth, it was all driving him forward. He managed to break free, his hand reaching for the knife at his side. But before he could strike, the man staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face. You really don't know what you're up against, the man muttered, his voice filled with frustration. You think you can just take what your father left? You think you're ready? Jake stood tall, the knife in his hand now steady. I don't care what you think, he said, his voice unwavering. I'm ready to finish this. For my father. For me. The man hesitated, then, with a sudden movement, he disappeared back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Jake stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart still pounding. The man was gone, but Jake knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. He had the answers now, the truth about his father's legacy, and the people who would stop at nothing to destroy it. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He had a mission now, one that would take him down a road far darker than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting for the future, and he would finish what his father had started, no matter the cost.